Hello and welcome to today's webinar on how to use mug books in your family history research. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Director of Education and Online Programs at the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and I'll be moderating today's event. NEHGS is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer this webinar today for our members and friends around the world. Giving today's presentation is Lindsay Fulton, Director of Research Services at NEHGS. Lindsay joined the Society in 2012, first as a member of the Research Services team, and then as a genealogist in the library. And since early 2016, Lindsay has overseen our Research Services Department. In addition to helping constituents with the research, Lindsay has also authored A Portable Genealogist on the topics of applying to lineage societies, the United States Federal Census 1790 to 1840, and the United States Federal Census 1850 to 1940. She is a frequent contributor to the NEHGS blog Vita Brevis and has appeared as a guest on the Extreme Genes radio program. Her areas of expertise include New England and New York research with a focus on lineage society applications. So in the 19th century, hundreds of towns and counties across the United States published biographical histories, or what are commonly referred to as mug books. These can be valuable resources for family historians, but because the sketches are unsourced and, as you'll see, potentially biased, the information should always be taken with a grain of salt and checked against vetted or original sources. Lindsay will discuss the who, what, when, where, why, and how of these resources, and throughout her presentation will provide valuable tips on how to evaluate the content and how to responsibly incorporate that information into your family tree. At any time during the presentation, please feel free to write a question in the panel to the right of your screen. Lindsay will answer as many as she can in the time provided. There is no handout for today's presentation, but you can click on the icon of a camera in the upper right hand of your screen to take screen captures. If you don't see that icon, it may be because your window is full screen. So if you just kind of adjust that window, you should see the icon. We're also recording this event, and starting tomorrow, you can easily go back and review any of the content from the presentation on our website. So don't feel like you need to take lots of notes today. You will be able to review the content at a later time. All right, so with that, I will turn things over to Lindsay.
Thank you, Ginevra, and welcome everyone today to our discussion about mug books. I have an affinity to the mug books because my genealogy is actually drastically split between the old world and the new. My mother's ancestry is primarily new immigrants, while my dad's is an older line. His family is from the Midwest. They migrated from Virginia and Tennessee in the 1840s and 1850s. They also came from Germany in the 1860s and 1870s. And it's primarily because of these Midwest ancestors that I fell in love with what we know as mug books. So, first thing to talk about is, what is a mug book? Well, the term mug refers to a face or a mouth of a person. So mug books are often are sometimes referred to as brag books at the same time. And they're termed so because they include illustrations, or a mug, also like a mug shot, sometimes with illustrations with short biographies of residents of a particular town or city or county. Ada Zach's, which is a popular genealogical glossary, it identifies a mug book as a county history book, which includes biographical sketches of residents. They were sold by subscription in advance of printing at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th centuries. Now, there are historians and biographers that think of them more specifically as portrait and biographical albums. So there's really an evolution of county books that we need to discuss. So a little history on the publishing. So there's the first wave that we see is in the 1860s and 1870s, when large publishers sent out surveyors to create stylized and beautifully bound atlases as keepsakes for residents of a particular location. However, as their popularity grew, we see an influx of more county books, or the county history books, in the mid-1870s. County histories have both biographies as well as the history of the county, and you may have seen those before. It's usually the first half of the book is about the particular county, and then the second half of the book is has the biographies of those residents. Usually included in that is biographies of more famous people, like U.S. presidents or inventors, etc. But there's also residential information in those as well. The third installment is the portrait and biographical album, which we see in the 1880s. These do not contain a history of the county. There's just biographies of the residents included in these portrait and biographical albums. Now, the county histories were influenced initially by a proclamation by President Grant, and the portrait books are actually born out of those histories. One, because they were more popular, and two, because the biographies are what sold the book. People wanted copies of the books that they appeared in, or that their parents or grandparents appeared in. So publishers were realizing fairly quickly that this was the best way for them to move more product. The tone of these particular county histories and portrait and biographical albums reflect the national narrative of the time, of that latter half of the 19th century, which is the pull yourself up by your bootstraps, the self-made man narrative. Immigrants are included in this discussion, as them as pioneers. They talk about the rural small town accomplishment. And they're playing that part that, as I was saying, they're playing a part in that larger national narrative of living the American dream. We can see in the introduction of the portrait and biographical record of Lee County, Illinois, which I'm including here on the screen, they tell the story of the county. So these portrait and biographical albums, or these mug books, are telling the story of the county's creation through the individual biographies of its residents. So the county is created because of these people. So here's the introduction from Lee County. And one of the lines from here is that it will be a record of many whose lives are worthy the imitation of coming generations. It tells how some, commencing life in poverty, by industry and economy, have accumulated wealth. So as you can see, this is a celebration of those individuals, those pioneers who have achieved the American dream by their own resourcefulness and hard work. Each of the entries uses very flowery and dramatic language. If you look at the last line of this particular entry, they're talking about this person's farm, and it's, quote, "His farm is one of the most attractive places in the vicinity, everything about it being kept to the highest standard, showing the presence of mastermind and hand." So again, flowery language, and then also you'll see the example on the right there. The books themselves were highly stylized, as they were meant for display on the parlor table for guests to look at, or even for their kids and grandkids to look at. So, who's included? Who are we going to find in these particular mug books? Generally speaking, and the majority of what I'm going to talk about today is going to be generally speaking, they're white males. There are some women, there are some females or spinsters that are included in there. For the most part, we're talking about farmers, small businessmen, or professionals, teachers as well as religious officials. These are like the representative population of the particular time. These people are usually living persons. There are some examples where these folks are being honored in memorandum, but for the most part, they're living persons giving the information themselves. And if we look really quickly just at the first 5 sketches, and these are the first 5 sketches of the Lee County, Illinois portrait and biographical record, we see that they're representative of the population. So of the first 5 that are included on there, we see 3 farmers. There's 1 doctor, and then there's 1 businessman, but there's 3 farmers. We don't have any immigrants in this example. However, we do have examples of the children or the grandchildren of immigrants. So we see that folks are coming from Dutch, German, and Irish ancestry. This is these are overall common individuals who are living in the county. Again, they're white males, but they're from the common occupation and financial status of that particular area. So as we saw with the first 5 abstracted sketches from Lee County, Illinois, mug books include very personal information about the individual that's included in the sketch. And that's including their place and date of birth, the names of their parents, their siblings, the marriage information might be included in there, or fraternal organizations. You could examine fraternal organization records for additional information that can lead you to more about that information. There might be information about military service, so you could examine pension records or military records to locate more detailed accounts of their service. So something important to remember is that mug books should never be the last stop. There's almost always more information provided in a mug book that will lead you to new information about that ancestor. So, on everyone's mind, are my ancestors going to be included in this mug book? Especially now that we know that they include vast, detailed information about a particular individual. Well, broadly speaking, there's a few things to keep in mind when we're evaluating the popularity of a mug book. The most important thing to remember is that this is a for-profit enterprise. So to make money, publishers needed to capitalize on larger subscriptions, a larger subscription base. So they needed to sell between 500 and 1,000 subscriptions of a particular book in order to make a profit. So by deduction, we need at least 1,000 people living in that vicinity in order that will purchase said book. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other is the prosperity of the population. So these mug books are really popular in the 1870s and 1880s. So this is right during Reconstruction. So we don't really see the prosperity of the southern states creating a large amount of county histories and mug books for that particular region. We do see them in the Midwest. And as we'll see going forward in a little bit, depending on the book, the person who's included in that particular book might pay between $25 and $125 to be included, whether that's a sketch just including their information, or a portrait of themselves with a sketch of their information. And finally, these are very popular in small rural towns. They're not very popular in cities, so we don't see these as often in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic states just because of their demographics. That doesn't mean that they didn't exist. We do have mug books in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. It's just not as popular as it is out in the American Midwest. So I'll show you what I mean. Of the 3,111 counties that were in existence in the 48 states in 1945, 1,380 counties are represented. So the red portion there of that pie chart are the counties that are represented by a county history or a portrait and biographical album. So what we're referring to as a mug book would be included there. But if we dig a little deeper and we start looking at those states with the most histories, or the most mug books, the blue portion here is Illinois. So in the state of Illinois, there are 102 counties. However, there are 483 county history or biographical albums, so mug books, that were published on in that particular state. So that's almost 5 times the number of counties that exist in the state as there are mug books. Now we can explain that by looking at that transition from the album, so from the county history to the album from the atlas. So there's always that instance where we could see a few renditions of a particular county just done in a different way. So there might be a county history of Lee County, and then there might be a portrait and biographical album of Lee County. And they might do a couple editions of that. So if we look again, we look in red, we have Pennsylvania there. There's 246 mug books that were done for the 67 counties that exist in Pennsylvania. There are 207 mug books that are done in Indiana for the 92 counties. And there are 207 also in Iowa for the 99 counties that exist in Iowa. So that's a pretty good representation, pretty good coverage for that particular population. Now if we dive even deeper, my family settled in Illinois, mainly around Effingham County. So I wanted to see how representative the Effingham County mug books were of the population, and I was looking really at the male population that was done in 1883. So the mug book was done in 1883. So the best population that I could find was looking at the 1880 United States Federal Census. So I went on to that, and I found that the number included in that population was 18,929. Now that's including men, women, and children. But if we look at that population and we just look at those males that are over the age of 18, in 1880, we get 5,077. In the Effingham County mug books, there's 530 sketches. So we do a little math, which I don't like, but we did it anyway. We found out that about 10% of those males that could have been included were included in a mug book. This, of course, doesn't take into consideration the other individuals that are included in the sketch. It's just that main person. However, I think this shows that a large portion of the population in Effingham County that was living there in 1880 was included in this particular mug book. And I can prove that because when we look at my great-grandfathers that are living in the area, so if we look there starting with Emmanuel Brown, we can see that I know nothing about him. I know who he married, I know when he was born, I don't really know where he died, so I actually have not been able to find him in a mug book because I don't really know where to look. I don't know if he was still living around the 1870s or 1880s, so I wasn't able to really find him. The next is James Massey. And James died, unfortunately, he was pretty young when he died, so he was not included in that particular mug book either because he's dying before it was actually published. However, my final two, this Nicholas Wharton and George Dury, both of those men were included in the mug book for Effingham County. And it's lovely information that's included in there. And we can see in the sketch of Nicholas T. Wharton that, and again, this is from the History of Effingham County, Illinois, published in 1883. It's published by O.L. Baskin Company, which is a smaller company. It's not one of the larger companies that was mass producing these books, but still, it's giving us wonderful information about Nicholas Wharton. It's all written in the first person, or it's all written in the present tense, at least about Nicholas. So he's a native of Spotsylvania County. He's an active member of the order of A, F, and AM. He is a Democrat. So just by looking very quickly at this sketch, we can see that most likely Nicholas is the one providing this information, and he's definitely still living at the time when this record is created. So when we think about this going forward with record analysis, we need to always think about that. When is this record created? So it's published in 1883. Who is the person creating it? What is the publishing company? Something to keep in mind. Is it a large company? Is it a small company? Is it based out of Chicago? Is it from a local, a more local city or town? And then who's the person giving the information? Is the person still living? If not, who is most likely the other individual who would have been giving that information? So if we look a little bit deeper at this entry for Nicholas, we can see that he's a resident of Welton, which I knew that he was somewhat from there. I always knew it as Gilmore. Apparently those two names are, and I'm not from the area, so forgive me, but apparently those two names are kind of interchangeable. They're referring to the same neighborhood area. We have that he's born on the 25th of June, 1828. This is something that I have not been able to find anywhere else on the planet except this particular book. I can't find a Bible record or a birth record I don't even have a death record for this particular individual. So really this is the best information that I have about his particular birth. I also don't have a marriage record for him. So this wonderful sketch that I have for Nicholas shows that he's married to Rebecca Jane Kagi. It's not on this page, it's on the next column over. I have the names of his children, the names of his siblings. I've been able to trace all of those siblings forward. In this record, he refers to his father, Benjamin Morton, and that he served in the War of 1812. So using this information, it's almost like a finding aid. So I used this to find his pension record in 1812, Benjamin's, not Nicholas's. There's also information about his mother. So his mother was Lucy Chandler. She was born in Old Virginia. She's referred to in the present tense. She's now residing, so the quote here is, she's now residing with her children in Ohio. Now she moved to Illinois at some point with Benjamin Morton before he died in 1855, but then she moved back in with her children. So I know from this particular sketch that I'm probably going to find Lucy dying in Ohio, not in Illinois, and that's actually what I ended up finding. However, the most important thing that I've been able to use a mug book for was for this particular individual, Nicholas T. Wharton, when I was applying to the DAR. I had no record, zero record, of Nicholas being the son of Benjamin Wharton and Lucy Chandler. The only record that I have is this one that we're looking at right here. I have a probate record showing when Nicholas died, but I don't have any other information. All I have is this and the probate record. And I cited this on my DAR application, and because this was contemporary to the time, because Nicholas was still living when this book was published, and because the information is most likely coming from Nicholas, and it's so close to him, I mean, he's most likely going to know the names of his parents, they took that as enough evidence to show that that connection was made or was provable. So mug books are great. The other grandfather that I have included in the Effingham County, Illinois history is George W. Dury. Now he's included as one of those sketches of a deceased individual. It includes information about his family, or it includes information about him coming to the area, as well as his family. It also refers to his wife in the present tense, so I know that she is still living at the time. And the quote, which is on the opposite page, is that she is now living on the old homestead farm, which consists of 160 acres of well-improved land. So based on the information included here, I can deduce that this was done in 1883. It was published in 1883. So I know that George W. Dury died before then. This particular mug book does not specify exactly when he died, but I know that it's going to happen before 1883. I know that it's done by the smaller publishing company, but I also know that the information is most likely coming from his wife, Mary Sensel, or Mary Dury. And the fun part about this is the initial photo that I had shown. Mary Sensel is the one that's sitting in the chair there, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and actually there's great-grandchildren in there as well, to put a face with a name. Okay, so one of the most important details that I often lecture about is how a record or how a collection or how a source is created. because this, in essence, is the integrity of the record. What were the steps that were taken to create the record? That's how we can really analyze how valid and accurate a particular source or collection is. So again, this is the most common way of creating a mug book. I'm sure that it was done other ways as well, but I'm speaking in broad terms. But this, the most common way was for a large national publisher. So from Philly or Chicago or Denver, they would send people out to speak with the most informed residents of a community. So that might be a businessman, someone that's running the newspaper, a town officer, anyone that would be able to locate and identify potential clients, really who would be willing and able to purchase a subscription to a mug book, that would want to be included as one of the biographical sketches in that particular compilation. So there were writers that were going into the field that were identifying the busybodies about town that could identify those particular people who would want to be included in a sketch. So once all of those folks were identified, they would be contacted. The authors would travel to the town and they would set up shop in a tavern or in a post office or a shop, and they would write letters. So there were really two ways of doing it. One would be that they would go and actually interview people or collect questionnaires themselves, or they would write letters back and forth. Customers were shown examples of mug books that were done previously. They would take money from folks. The orders would be taken. If a sketch needed to be done of a particular individual, that might be done when the author came to town. I've also heard of instances where a sketch was sent in to a particular publisher. And it might have, the biographical information might have either been dictated or a questionnaire might have been completed. And you can see this if you start looking at more and more and more mug books, you'll start noticing that it's almost like it's like a form letter that they're completing. And in that case, it's most likely coming from one of those questionnaires. They would advertise in the local paper. For example, this is a clipping that's aimed to secure orders for the Illustrated History of Allen County, Indiana, which was published by the Kingman Brothers. And the quote from here is that these are no roving adventurers seeking to turn pennies, but men who have a reputation to maintain. In no instance have their books failed to give the best satisfaction, and no one who has a copy will sell it for what it cost him. So again, we're trying to turn a profit. We're trying to get people to buy more and more and more of these portrait and biographical albums or these mug books. So the main driving force is money. So that leads me to a tip to keep in mind, and that is that money talks. So I think I've illustrated this. The mug books were primarily a financial enterprise that were driven by money and popularity. And as you've seen with the two examples of my great-grandfathers, the length of the column varies from person to person. So the one that we saw for Nicholas Wharton, that was really basically one column, but that would spread across two columns, whereas the one for George Dury was much shorter. So it's easy to deduce that some folks paid more than others. So the longer the column, the more you paid. If your picture is included, the more you paid. So that could explain why some people have pictures of themselves or their farm or their homestead. So that leads us to, if money talks, could there be more information that maybe didn't make it to the particular publishing final copy? My short answer is maybe. So it's depending on the organizational tendencies of either the author or the publisher. And one of the tricky parts with mug books is that they don't tend to give credit to the authors. They refer to the authors in broad terms. They give credit to the editor, but those specific people are not identified for the most part. But if they are, something to look at would be if the author donated his papers. Did the publisher keep the papers? Was there more than one book published? Like I was saying before, is this the first edition? Is it the fourth edition? Is it a county history? Is it a biographical album? And as an example, I examined one of the more famous biographers of the 19th century to try to locate potential papers or letters that might exist in an archive. So I looked at, so I was looking for an archive that held the papers of Hubert H. Bancroft. He was born in 1832 in Ohio, and he dies out in Oregon in 1918. And he's responsible for several mug books on those that are living in the western states. The sketches that are included in these particular mug books sold for much larger sums than those smaller county histories that I was discussing from the American Midwest. They were more in the range of $1,000 to, well, upwards of $1,000, whereas the ones in those smaller counties are, you know, between $25 and $125, depending on what they were including. So it's easy to say that these particular mug books are encompassing more famous and wealthier residents. However, it's important to indicate here that the sketches themselves are exactly like those of the Midwest counties. It's still the American dream ideal that's touted. The ancestry of those individuals is included and discussed. There's pictures of them, just like there were in those smaller county histories. So they're just the same. It's just a little bit on it's a larger scale because we're talking about a state or a couple states rather than a smaller county. So to find some record collections, I looked at Archive Grid, which is one of my favorite websites. It's a free website. It's archivegrid.org. And anyone who works with WorldCat, and WorldCat is an online library catalog, Archive Grid returns hits of manuscripts and original material that's cataloged in a library or an institution or an organization that uses WorldCat. So this is just an example of the first page where you would just do a search. And I would search for, if you know the author's name, I would search for that specific author. If you know the publisher's name, the publishing company's name, you could search specifically for that as well. So there were many hits actually for Hubert Howe Bancroft, but the one that caught my eye was a couple pages down, and it was at the University of California, Berkeley. It's this collection of records pertaining to Hubert Howe Bancroft, but it's of the library and publishing companies covering the years 1864 to 1910. And we know from the evolution of county history books that this is right in the wheelhouse of when those were most popular. So if we dive a little bit further into what this collection looks like, if we look at the finding aid that's included at the University of California, Berkeley, we can see here that the collection includes chapter notes and chapter drafts, newspaper clippings, general notes. It's a huge collection. This is 5 boxes, 25 containers, 22 oversized boxes. It covers about 55 linear feet. Looks like that's a sizable collection. And if we're talking about notes and newspaper clippings and chapter drafts, if most likely there's information in these first drafts and these first notes that did not make it to that particular published volume. So if you have an ancestor that was in one of those sketches that was written by Hubert Howe Bancroft in one of those larger Western state mug books, I would recommend looking at this because there might be correspondence between Mr. Bancroft and your ancestor. I'm sure it's a treasure trove of information about those particular individuals. But if you're not able to find information about the author of a particular mug book using Archive Grid or another search, I would try contacting a local library or historical society of the county where that particular mug book was created. Because, again, these mug books don't usually identify the author of the book. So those notes might be contained in another place, so they might be held on that local level. And when we're thinking about this, we should also keep in mind that colleges and institutional archives may have these notes or correspondence as well. Okay, so now that we've found our ancestor in a mug book, we have to now think about evaluation. Just as we've been doing with Nicholas T. Wharton and with George Dury, we have to think about how accurate the record is. How close was that person to the information that's included? Are they a few steps away from it? So are they a few generations away from that particular information? That's something to keep in mind. So this is a play on Chapter 2 of Robert Charles Anderson's Elements of Genealogical Analysis. And he addresses this exact topic on the questions that should be answered or contemplated when evaluating a specific record. So these are the questions that you should really always be asking when you're looking at any record. Is when is that record created? Who created it? So who was the publisher in our case when we're talking about mug books? How big, how small are they? Who provided that information? And I think that now we're at that point where we can draw a conclusion based on the general knowledge that we have of how a mug book is created, that if we're talking about someone in the first person, we're probably talking about someone who's giving that information. If we're talking about a deceased individual, we're probably getting that information from someone else. So based on that information, or based on that analysis, we can then draw a conclusion. So let's look at an example of the times where we should really be critical of a particular mug book entry. So this is an entry that was in the Lee County, Illinois biographical sketches for Elijah and Daniel B. Raymond. And in one of the first lines of this sketch, they claim, quote, "Our subjects' ancestors were Englishmen of the same blood as the Pilgrim Fathers of the Mayflower, and some of them were among the same colonists of New England, and made their home in the quaint old city of Salem and in the town of Wareham, Mass." The sketch then goes on to claim, "The first to avail himself of the privileges of religious freedom in America was John Raymond, who came hither in 1636. So if you notice, this sketch is including some very specific information. I mean, we're getting that the immigration date is 1636, but we're also getting some very general information in that they're sharing the same blood as the Pilgrim Fathers of the Mayflower. I mean, what does that mean? So we need to be critical of that particular statement. So if we think about our 4 questions again, we think about when was this mug book created? Well, this was published in 1892. Who's creating this record? The Biographical Publishing Company of Chicago, which is one of the larger publishing companies that was involved in the creation of mug books. Who provided this information? Who provided the information about John Raymond coming to America? Well, we can see from later on in the sketch, because they're talking about Elijah and Daniel in the first person, or in the present tense, I should say, we can tell that the information's coming from them, most likely, but they're talking about something that happened in 1636. So there are many generations between that and us, and we have no citations here. We have no explanation on how they found or how they know this information. You know, it's not saying that it's coming from a family Bible or anything like that. So in order to draw a conclusion about this particular sketch, we need to do some more research to verify whether or not this is correct or not. So we're going to use one of my favorite resources out there. and because the immigration date was 1636, I can look at the Great Migration Directory to attempt to verify that information included in the mug book. So we find this one record. So there are no Raymonds, but there is a Raymond for a Richard Raymond. We all know in genealogy that spelling doesn't count, so I was thinking that maybe this could be for the same person. Maybe potentially the father of our John. It's some of this information's matching. It's close to the immigration date. It's including information about Salem, which was specifically identified in that particular mug book. So I wanted to look at it a little bit closer. So if we look at the mug book, if we look at the Great Migration Begins entry, and we dive a little bit further, the information doesn't jive with what we had hoped for. For example, Bob uses direct original source evidence for these conclusions, and he has evidence that the family, while they were initially from Salem, they're moving to Connecticut, so they end up in Norwalk or in Saybrook. If we're talking specifically about John, so John who, according to the mug book, is coming in 1636, we have a John listed here. He's born about 1635. He's marrying his wife in Connecticut. So there's no evidence that they are from Wareham. And the mug book is claiming that John is coming in 1636, and the quote again to remind you is, "He was the first to avail himself of the privileges of religious freedom in America, who came hither in 1636. So if we're using a very generous definition of the word hither, then maybe this is somewhat accurate. But for the most part, if we compare what's in Great Migration to the mug book, you'll see that there's some drastic differences. So again, Great Migration, Bob Anderson is drawing from original sources and he's analyzing original documentation, is coming up with the immigrant ancestor as Richard Raymond, whereas the mug book has John Raymond. The arrival dates are off. The residences, while they both start in Salem, they end up in two very different locations. The mug book gives the line of descent from the Raymond ancestry, so they go from John to William, and then there's 3 Daniels, and then Daniel and Elijah are the son of that last Daniel. So that's a huge amount of information that's included, but we would really need to double check all of that because we are finding some issues with what's included in the sketch as it is. So I would really argue that the entry in Great Migration is much more accurate than the information coming from the mug book. Something else to keep in mind is that we need to watch out for tall tales. And this is true in all genealogical research, because if something sounds too good to be true, it just might be. So when it comes to analyzing mug books, it's also important to remember that these are referred to as brag books for a reason, because people might be bragging, and they might be bragging about something that they don't really know the full truth of. So if we look at a case of family lore, which I know we run into all the time with genealogy, this is an example of William Teal. This is the sketch for William Teal, and this gives tons of information about where he's from, what he does for a living, his children's names, where he's specifically living in Section 19 in Barnett Township. This is actually coming from the Portrait and Biographical Album of DeWitt County, which was published in 1891. And this was done by the Chapman Brothers of Chicago, which is a large publishing firm. But in one of the statements for this particular sketch, they're claiming that the father of Mrs. Teal was of English lineage, tracing his descent from Robert Wilson of London, England. That gentleman had 2 sons, one of whom, Benjamin, came to America in the Mayflower landing at Plymouth Rock in 1620. Now, there was no man that we could find with the name Wilson aboard the Mayflower, at least according to William Bradford. The list has the surname Winslow, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, but there is no Robert, there is no Benjamin, so like the Raymond sketch, we need to be wary when we're examining the rest of this sketch for other tall tales or other generalizations that have been propagated by the family and maybe is taken as truth by that person who is providing that information for that particular sketch. And finally, another common problem with mug books is the issue of pronouns. I blame this on the rapid publishing practices during the 1870s to 1890s because writers would hasten to complete the mug books and maybe not take into consideration that their sentences may not make too much sense. So if we look at this sketch for Thomas Hollis, so the first statement here is that he was born in the state of Delaware, September 15th, 1827, to Noah and Catherine Hollis. The very next statement is he was born in Delaware in 1807, removed to Ohio, and subsequently to Illinois. Now, the complicated factor there is, now we know that if you keep reading, you can figure out that Thomas's father is the one that's born in 1807. And it's referring to Noah, so this he here is referring to Noah. But that is a difficult two sentences to string together. Additionally, there's the comment here, he with his two sons, Willard and William, served in the war, the former being killed. Further down, they say, they were the parents of 4 children, of whom our subject was the 4th child. So while this says he with his 2 sons, this doesn't necessarily mean that he has only 2 sons, just that he has 2 sons named Willard and William. He has another son named Thomas, which is who this sketch is about, and then another child. They also refer to these 2 sons, Willard and William, as serving in the war, which we can assume is the Civil War, but it doesn't actually say. So we would need to do much more research to determine what war that William, Willard, and Noah were participants in. Some other common problems is that the authors might have read those forms wrong that either came in through a letter writing campaign or during an interview. They might have misread the notes. The individuals that the sketches are about themselves, they might have misremembered information. They might have been told that their ancestor came over on the Mayflower when there's no proof of that. There could be the use of vernacular words instead of formal names. So if there's a nickname of a particular individual or a location, those could be included in a mug book, and maybe there's no formal name given and you don't really know what they're talking about. And then sometimes there's too much information or too little information. We've seen that, we saw that with one of the first sketch about the Raymonds. There's just a very broad statement about having, sharing the same blood as the people on the Mayflower. We always need to be careful when broad statements like that are made. So if you cannot find your ancestor in a mug, or actually, where can we find the mug books that our ancestors would be in? Libraries is the most important and the first place that we should all be looking. However, because these books are, because they were published in the 1880 time frame, they are now out of copyright, so we can find a majority of them online in digital format, either with HathiTrust or Google, Archive, Open Library. Family Search has plenty of them as well. It's always good to check out those particular areas. And if you can't find something online, there are these things called bibliographies, and they're pretty comprehensive. There was the one done by Philby, and the other one's done by Peter. There's 2 that are done by Peterson. They're very well done. They discuss all of the county histories for all of the counties in the country. So if something was done, and they have been updated, I think the 1985 is the most recent, that might be something that you would want to check just to see if, because if something was published more recently, it might not be one of those mug books that's included in the digital format. Okay, so to review what we've gone over, we've identified what a mug book is. It is a county history or a portrait and biographical album, which included biographical sketches of its residents. They were sold by subscription in advance of printing at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. When we think about the availability of a mug book, we have to always think about the subscription base. So are there at least 1,000 people living in the area at the time? What's the prosperity of that county or town? Remember, they had to pay between $25 and $125 for a sketch, so they have to be able to afford that. And that they were most popular in those small rural areas. We talked about the creation and publication of those particular mug books. So how did the publishers get all of this information? How did those authors fill out questionnaires? Was there a letter writing campaign? We've discussed how all of that was done in a general sense. And then we talked about record evaluation. 4 things to keep in mind when you're looking at a record. This can be used other than just with mug books, but when a record, we need to think about when it was created, who created the record, who provided the information, and then what conclusions can we draw. And then finally, we discovered where we can find our mug books, both online and in print.
All right, so with that, thanks, Lindsay, for your great presentation. Let's tackle your questions. If you have anything that you'd like to ask Lindsay, please go ahead and type it in the questions panel, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time provided. So Lindsay, Cola asks, do mug books exist for Canada?
They do. I don't know too much about them. However, I do know that most of the provinces are included. Most have what we are terming mug books, whether that be a county history where they're including the biographical sketches of that particular person, or if they have one of those specific portrait and biographical albums. I think that it leans more towards those county histories, so the books that are going to include the history of the county and then some of its residents in like that second part. But yes, I have seen them for Canada before.
Great. Now, Mary asks, how many mug book publishers were there? Were some more reliable than others? And in your adventures in genealogy, does one stand out as being kind of the most reliable?
Well, there were many different, there was a huge boom of mug books in that time frame, so 1870 to 1900. That's when the majority of them are published. So because of that, because of the huge influx of them, we see that there's there's a variety of publishers that are getting involved in this. They were done mostly by large publishing firms, so firms that are based out of large cities like Chicago, Philly, Denver, but they were done on a local level, so that the Effingham County mug book that I talk about a lot, that's done by a smaller publisher. I tend to find that one more reliable, but I think that that's because they may have taken a little more time with that particular mug book than the ones that were like mass produced. That's when we start seeing things get a little bit more sloppy. That's when we see the pronoun problem. I'm sure that they never fact-checked anything, but just in terms of keeping organized, were trying to write. I see that the smaller firms tended to do a little bit of a better job with that. The larger publishers, they would really use, it was like almost cutting and pasting. They were just inserting that county's name. So it was that big glorious, everyone in this county is living the American dream, and they're providing such wonderful industriousness to America. Insert county name. It really wouldn't vary from, it wouldn't really vary from county to county. So I think that if it's a smaller publisher, that they would have taken a little bit more time with the production, so that might yield more accurate information, or at least more understandable information. But for the most part, mug books were not, there's not really citations for them, at least in that early 20th century, late 19th century.
Thanks. Now Frankie asks, do they have mug books for African American families?
They do. They're not as common as the mug books that are in the Midwest for the over 18 white males. I have seen them for African Americans before. They're done similar, where they would be discussing farmers, or local businessmen, the local butcher, something like that. So it doesn't necessarily need to be like a famous resident. So they would be done similar to the ones in the Midwest. But yeah, they do exist.
Now Pauline asks, so when you're using information from a mug book as part of a proof argument, you gave the example of using one in your own Lineage Society application. How much discussion should there be about the reliability of that information? Should you list errors and or verified facts? How would you go about doing that?
I would do both of those things. I would discuss so I would look at the sketch in total. What were the facts that were given in the sketch? And then were those facts, were you able to verify those particular facts? That's the first step. The second step would be to identify any problems or maybe misinformation that was included in that particular sketch. And that's really the way that you would do any proof argument. So if you were to talk about, if you were to show a death record, for example, to show a connection between two people, but there's problems on a death record, and there's, that's something that we run into a lot as a genealogist, where there's going to be an issue on a death record because the person dying is not giving that information. So it's always good to identify where you're finding an issue, and especially if you can explain it away. So if the person is not referred to in the present tense, then you might be able to explain why that information was incorrect. If there's 3 Johns in an ancestral line, and then a Benjamin, and then another 3 Johns, and if they screwed up, that line of descent, you could kind of explain that, because it's easy to make that type of mistake. But the best way to show that particular sketch was accurate would be to just kind of go line by line and show that every other detail has been accurate.
Thanks. Now I know a few of you have asked for the list of those websites that Lindsay showed a few slides ago. I can actually include those in my follow-up email to you as links, so you don't have to worry about rigorously writing them all down. I can provide that in my email to you. So just a few more questions. We have a question about, so after the Civil War, did the South create many mug books, short of money, post-war, and how, so maybe answer that question first.
Yes, so there are mug books in the southern states, just as they would be in the Midwest. They're just not as common. So that was just, so when we were talking about mug books today, we were doing it in broad terms. There's almost always a mug book for a particular area. It just doesn't have as wide coverage as it does in places like Iowa or Illinois or Pennsylvania, where mug books were very popular and they did extremely well for those particular publishers. So because they were doing well, the publishers were just kept producing content for them, which any good businessman would do. But they do exist in the South. I don't want to dissuade anyone from looking in those particular areas. It's just that because of the popularity and availability, they might not have been created for that particular area.
Okay, so we're running out of time here. If we haven't gotten to your question, please consider writing to me, and we could potentially answer that for you. Also, if you want more assistance with your research, more hands-on help with your family history project, do consider scheduling a consultation with one of our experts or hiring our research services team. If you're interested in learning more about these services, you can write to the email addresses on the current slide. I'll also include that information in my follow-up email to you tomorrow. So thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.